Alright guys, so in the previous video we set up the entities for both the use case and then we set up an entity for a repository that holds all of the entities for the tape measure. Kind of cut that the entities, the repo one a little short. It's kind of boring, but essentially we just fleshed it all out doing test-driven development. All our tests are passing. So let's move on to the next step. Let me flip back over to Bamboo here and my paper. Let me move this guy over to here. Let's start a new sheet. So let's talk about what's next. So we've got our entities working. Let's start out by just kind of drawing a quick diagram about how this all works together. So we'll start out with a person over here. So here's how I like to think about how a sim works, the cycle of life in a sim. You've got your user over here. So this is a person. And they're doing something. And they're being presented with a view. And I'm going to make this look like kind of a little, like a document kind of thing. So this is the view. Right? So the user is looking at the view. You know, they're seeing the view here. They're being presented. This is whatever they're seeing. This is, you know, the Babylon viewer, the web page, the graphics, everything. This is what they're looking at. That's the view. At some point, the user is going to interact with that view. They're going to do some sort of controller. They're going to do an input. It'll be a mouse click, a touch, keyboard, voice. I don't know what it's going to be. But the way that gets brought into the sim is the user acts on a controller. So this is a thing, and so the user acts here. And this could be, you know, the controller is a mouse click, a press, a drag, all that stuff. That controller takes that input device and changes it into something that's useful for our domain. So the domain is like our sim. The root, like the controller is kind of like specific to a controller. So it's specific to a touch, or it's specific to maybe it's a stylus that's specific to that particular input device, a keyboard. And it takes that data, probably does some math. Usually it's like pixel math. Like if you're doing a drag, it's going to convert from pixel position, or if you're doing a pinch to zoom, you know, your finger distance apart, you got to do some calculations based on that, and you're going to come up with a number that you want to zoom the camera in or out. You're going to dolly the camera in or out by this amount. So the controller is doing the kind of pixel to domain math typically, and converting stuff to be useful for our domain. And then it gets sent into the next thing is the controller typically acts on what we call a use case. Oops, spelled that wrong. Let's clean that up. So the controller acts on a use case like this. All right. Then that use case, so the controller acts, let me get a different, probably should have used, let's use this color. Controller manipulates one or more use cases and does things. Maybe it's this, back to the camera zoom idea, it does a dolly. We're going to dolly camera, so the inputs could be something like distance or amount is what's coming in here, is what's being passed from the controller. So the controller is taking a pinch gesture, converting that to an amount, sending that to the use case. The use case in turn comes along and acts on one or more entities. So this is our entities. And this is the source of truth for our camera. In this, we'll just keep going with this camera example. It's the source of truth about where the camera is. You know, what is its radius or its, you know, distance, and the use case comes in and acts. It does the, you know, it says, all right, well, this guy wants to zoom on this particular point. So the input coming into the use case is maybe a point and a dolly amount or a zoom amount. It does a little bit of math to figure out, okay, well, now it's in the domain of, okay, I need to convert this to stuff that is specific to our camera. And it affects the entities. All right? Now, the entities, they have an observer typically. That's how I usually build these things, is they have an observer that, so there's a class out there, or another thing, an object out there, observing the entities and they've registered, and they'll be notified whenever an entity changes. And so that idea is typically called a presenter model. Right? So that's what we call this part, the presenter model. So the entity notifies the presenter model that something has changed. The presenter model then, in turn, comes around and it forms up this. I'm going to make my box a little bit different here. We're going to use kind of some UML notation, but it forms up an interface, a structure called the view model. So this guy makes this. I got my arrows kind of backwards. The point of this step here is we want, well, let's finish this out. And then this view model is served up to the view. And the view applies that model. Now the intent of this little section over here, let me use my mouse, I noticed that points. The intent of this little section over here is the view is way out. If you think about, let me draw another picture over here. Let's talk about Bob's architecture a little bit. So, Bob's architecture, we've got our entities here. We've got the next layer out. I'm probably not using the right colors, but we're just thinking about layers. This is going to be the use cases. And then the next layer out is going to be the interfaces. And so that's going to be our controllers. And our presenter models. Right, that's this layer. No, I don't want that stuff. And then finally, the outer layer is our frameworks. Right, so this is our frameworks, and this is where React lives, for example. In this particular example, we're working in Babylon. Right, so if we wanted to kind of so that's what we're working with. And what we want to do is we know that these things on the outside, these frameworks, we want to keep them as independent from our domain as possible. When I'm talking about domain, I'm talking about domain is essentially, what do I want to do? Well, I don't know. Domain is essentially everything from here on in is our domain. So our domain is here. So it includes our presenters, or our interfaces, our use cases, and our entities. So we want to keep Babylon, we want to keep React, we want to keep them outside of our domain. And that's important because our views are the most volatile things we're working with. They're going to change the most. They're out of our control. We have no control over what Babylon is doing with their APIs. We have no control over what React is doing. We want them as far out of we want them outside of our domain. Also, the difference between domain and outside the domain is testability. It's really difficult to write good jest testing, unit testing for Babylon specific stuff. It's also difficult to write jest testing for view, like button colors and React specific stuff. So we push that all on the outside. And because of that testability issue, we want to make our views as dumb as possible. That is our goal in life. Make our views dumb. We want to be able to say, let's say Babylon gets deprecated. We have no control over that. We want to be able to flip to maybe Three.js. We want to be able to flip to maybe Unity. We want to be able to flip easily without having to rewrite our entire domain. So in order to do that, we push as much logic as we can inside to our domain and keep our views dumb. So getting back to this view model here, what that means is this presenter model, it's going to be written specifically for the view it's serving. So this presenter model is going to be specific for Babylon views if we're doing a view. It's going to be specific for a Babylon camera. If we were to flip to Three.js, we'd probably need to write a different presenter model, maybe. Or we just maybe need to do our view model different, form our view model different. But ultimately, this is an interface. It's not a class, and it doesn't have any logic in there. It's just an interface that holds values. And these values explicitly tell the view what to do. They tell the view, okay, I want you to be this position, I want you to be this rotation, I want you to be this scale. And this presenter model is doing the adaptation between our domain and our framework. So specifically, let's go back to our examples of the tape measures we've been working on. We know inside of our domain, our tape measures are only 2D planar. We have an X and a Y, we have a start position, and an X and a Y end position. Okay? When we get to showing this in Babylon, because we're going to render that tape measure in Babylon, we need to convert those positions into a vector 3. Babylon works in 3D vectors. It's 3D space. We also need to be thinking about, well, how is our Babylon vector going to work? Or how is our view going to want this data in the most useful way? And so going back to our tape measure model, in our 2D description of this, we had like a string, or we had a line, and we had the body of the tape here, and we called this PE, and we called this point here P start. And these are both 2D vectors. When we get to Unity, what we're going to find, probably what I'm thinking, is we're going to want this to be more like probably PO, which is like, no, I think we're just going to actually want a position. And we're going to want a rotation. And we're going to put this guy right here. And we'll probably flip it around, and then we're going to have like a length. And what that'll do is that'll allow us to put the head of our tape measure somewhere, the body of the tape measure. We could flip this around too. In fact, maybe we want to do that. It doesn't really matter. And then we know that this is going to be a 3D point, a transform. So we know how to position this with this vector here. We know how to rotate it so that it's pointing the right way. And then we know the distance here of the L along maybe the negative Z, or maybe we flip it all the way around so it's positive Z. And so that'll tell us, how long to send this mesh down to the end. We could orient it all around the origin too. In fact, that's probably what we'll do, but it doesn't matter. So what it'll look like is this is where we'll hook everything up, and then this will be L this way. And in the world of our tape measure, in the world of Babylon, this will now be X, this will probably be Y, and this will be Z. So anyways, all of this transformation between this 2D PS and PE to a 3D position and rotation and length, that happens here in the presenter model and is given to our view with this view model. So our view model will be composed of, we'll just say a position, and that's a vector 3, a rotation, we're just going to stick to Euler, which is also going to be a vector 3, and a length, which is a number. So this is what our view is going to need to render this thing properly. Probably find a few more things it's going to need, but this is what, oh, come on. This is what we need to do this conversion to. So the presenter model will be told when the entity changes, hey, something happened to my entity, and then it will create this view model and send it up to the view. Now, the last thing I'd like to discuss is, before we call this video done and we move on to writing code, is the cycle of life, in particular between these three entities over here. Gosh, I keep popping that notification out. We got our view, our presenter model, and our entity, and the VM right there. So let me make a little room over here, and we're going to draw these out. I'm going to draw more of a flow diagram, and unfortunately, I made my view and my presenter model the same color. So we're going to come back over here, and we're going to let's use this color here. We're going to flip to a whole different color palette, and we're going to make our view this color. so that we can see this. So let's down here, let's make a little cycle of life thing going on here. So here's our view. And then we've got our, we're going to do our presenter model purple. So we're going to do, and I'm just going to call it a PM. That's this. This is a PM. Oh, what are you doing? I don't want you. There we go. So that's our PM. And then finally, we're going to have our entities, which I'm going to make this color here. So this is our entities, and we're going to put them over here. And let's draw some lines down like that. Get our purple here. And, ooh. What is this one? This color, I think. All right, so start a new thing. So we're going to have an event come in. I don't know what that is. I don't want that. So we're going to have an event called create. So something is going to create, C-R-E-A-T, create our view, right? That's going to do something. So our view is going to get created. So note the view is what's created. So at some point the view comes along. Something tells it, oh, we need a new tape measure in here, or something like that. It'll probably come from the repo. There'll be another component that's watching our tape measures repo, subscribing to that on view created, and it's going to make the view. That view is responsible for creating the PM. So that view creates this presenter model. All right. That presenter model in turn subscribes here. Right? So that does this. All right, so that's our startup process. Oh, we have one more thing. During the subscription, we do initialize. So let's bring this down a little bit more. The view is initialized. All right, so we're told to create. The view starts up, makes its presenter model, subscribes to the entity, and then it initializes itself to whatever the entity state is in. So, you know, this entity is going to be 2 positions for this tape measure. And it's going to do the conversion to a vector 3 for a position, a rotation, and a length. It's going to do that, and it's going to set its view up. All right? Now, because it's subscribed, somebody, this use case up here at some point is going to act on the entity, and it's going to change it. So let me, so what's going to happen here is a use case is going to change the entity, right? We don't really care how this happens, but a use case comes in, it's going to change this. So that kicks off this series of events down here. This is going to notify, because this guy has subscribed, it's going to notify the PM. And the PM is going to in turn update the view with a new VM. This is initializing with a VM as well. All right. So then the view changes. So this is somebody dragging the tape measure. Something is going to happen. Remember, that comes from the controller. Oh, why does that keep happening? That comes from the controller, which acts on a use case, which kicks off the entity over here. So that's what's going on there. So the use case changes the entity notifies the presenter model updates the view. Cool. At some point, we also need to handle dispose. So that's going to be, somebody could delete the tape measure. So that's going to delete, that's going to change our repo. It's going to change our lister or something like that. So this is a delete. That's going to change. That's going to kick off this event where this is going to now dispose our PM, which is in turn going to come over here and unsubscribe. There we go. So that's how this whole thing works. That's how we're going to wire this guy up to connect the dot from our entity to the presenter model, to the view model, to the view. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop this video. And in the next video, we'll start by creating our presenter model and defining our view model. Right on.